Hey, Tiffany.
Oh,
Okay, I'm getting everything set up real quick.
okie doke.
Did you get a message from Just Say? He said he couldn't find his link. I just sent him mine, so he might be coming in under my name.
Yeah, we can just have him change,
Yeah,
rename himself.
yeah, yeah. Okay.
So I got the Q&A is on, and it's just answered questions only. I pretty much turned chat off. I turned chat off. It's just panelists.
That's fine.
Okay. And
Do we
then
want the chat off, or is that what we did last time?
If you'd like it on, Dwayne can get it on. Mostly, I'm just worried about making sure we get our panelists in.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking we
you want me
want
to resend a link to all the panelists?
That'd be great.
Thank
Because
you.
they're already in the waiting room, but they can't get in.
Oh, if they're in the waiting room, I have to start the webinar and then promote them. Or you can too, but
Yeah,
Just go ahead and send them the link again.
Okay.
Does that, I don't know the procedure, Dwayne, so I'm
Yeah,
looking
no,
for
you're good
advice.
because I only have you two as panelists. There were nobody else listed as panelists that I was received.
so can we start the webinar and then bring them in?
Yeah, of
Yeah, that
course.
sounds good.
Let's do that. Because
Okay.
I believe Annalisa is there too. She just
Okay, so
texted me.
I'm going to start right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so people should start coming in, and then
So one of the challenges we need to make sure is that the panelists, that we have a sign up for the panelists that's separate somehow. That message isn't quite getting through.
so if you go to attendees, since you know the list, if you just go to more, you can promote to panelists, or if you just
Okay.
tell me the names, I can promote them to panelists.
So go
We are live though, so
I can
welcome
see
everybody.
I can see Jose. I'm gonna add him.
Hi, everyone.
Good day.
Good.
I can't start my video first because it says that the host has stopped it. So it's Annalisa here speaking.
Hello, Annalisa.
I know there were other people waiting in the waiting room. I don't know if you were able to see them and let them in.
Yes, yep, we can see everyone now.
Okay.
Everything is in flow. Good morning, everyone.
Good
Yes,
morning.
Amo?
Yes, do we have an order?
Yeah, we do have an order. And if you don't mind me going first, I'd appreciate that.
Yes, so what's the order for the whole panel?
I'll post it in the chat right now.
Okay, great.
Thank you, everybody, and appreciate your patience. We apologize for the technical difficulties this morning.
No worries.
So to those who are in our audience and are waiting, if you'll kindly give us about 2 minutes, we'll all be ready to go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to University of California, Irvine and our Aicre philosophy event. This is the second of a year-long workshop that is a partnership between two of our most valuable departments on the campus. My name is Tiffany Willoughby Herrard, and I'm an associate professor of African American Studies and also the equity advisor and special assistant to the dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have an amazing panel of scholars from around the world today who will be presenting. We would be remiss if we did not thank our colleagues, Ama Ray from the Department of Dance, Annalisa Koliva, who is the chair of the Department of Philosophy, and also our longstanding partnership with Aicre, which you will hear a lot more about in a little while. We also want to thank Dwayne Pack and Jennifer Choi and Thomas Reeves and Josh Charles for all of the work that they have done to support this program. So the order of the day will be some very brief introductions by myself, Esama, and Annalisa, and then 4 presentations of about 10 minutes max from each of our presenters, and then a moderated discussion and hopefully a freewheeling visionary conversation among our guest speakers. After that, we will stop recording and have an open-ended conversation that is candid, that is just an in-house conversation for people who are affiliates of the philosophy department at UCI. So if you are not an affiliate, we are going to close the session to you. This is a time for folks to do some in-house work on transformation. And again, we welcome you and are so grateful for you all to join us today. Okay, so I'll begin. Aicre philosophy has highlighted our interest in future partnerships with the Collegium for Black Women in Philosophy, the Azanian Philosophy Society, the Caribbean Philosophical Association, and the Pan-African Philosophical Organizations of the Caribbean and the Nordic states, among many others. These groups are led by African, Black, and Caribbean scholars in their respective subfields of philosophy, ranging from analytical philosophy, European philosophy, linguistics, logic, human rights, artificial intelligence, and histories of the Haitian Revolution. The organizations emerge both in part out of a long history of legalized and normalized racial segregation in higher education globally that has positioned these scholars in particular ways as outsiders, even in areas where they have the most information. These organizations do not exist because these scholars wish to, quote, self-segregate. Rather, they exist because said scholars had to create pathways in higher education outside of the major regional learned societies and associations where the legalized history of racial segregation was often normalized into shabby treatment or racial discrimination in the various disciplines. When higher education and graduate education in particular actually creates the barriers to recognizing excellence and contributing to the expansion of democracy, learned societies and academic professional associations have been created to correct for these obstacles and in more visionary ways to offer a whole new pathway to the future. I will close my remarks now and welcome Esama Ray. And as is my way, for those of you all who know me, I'll welcome in the ancestors who attend to us and accompany us, and hopefully will feel welcomed enough to enable us to do the brilliant work that's coming through this kind of partnership. Esama?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Wherever you are, I'm assuming many people are here in Irvine, but there are others joining us from elsewhere. Please feel free to let us know where you are. So as you can see, my virtual background is animating Aicre, which is the acronym for the Africana Institute for Creativity, Recognition, and Elevation, which I began at UCI in 2015 with Gugi Wathiongo and Tiffany Willoughby Herrard. It was really initially as a response to the UN's Decade of People of African Descent worldwide. And for me, I wanted to bring that question as to what that elevation is in the local context for me at this institution. I have been part of an amassing of individuals from UCI and many beyond in international spaces that have come together, beginning to shape what Aicre is intent upon, which is elevation, which is bringing about solutions from the ground up. And the first space that we really needed to really interrogate was, well, what is the foundation for the space that we are intent upon elevating? What does it mean? And who are we? And who's part of this conversation? And how ready are we to have those conversations that really do enable the groundswell that needs to happen for solutions in this world to manifest? It is about all of us being at the table. I'm not going to take up too much bandwidth today because we have some incredible speakers that have a lot to share with us. And so now I'm going to hand over to the chair of the philosophy department, Annalisa Coliva. Thank you and have a great morning.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second pivot for the program Aicre plus Philosophy. I'm Annalisa Coliva. I'm the chair of the Department of Philosophy. And I'm incredibly thankful to Tiffany and Sama for their wonderful work with Aicre and this particular program, Aicre plus Philosophy, that has given us in the philosophy department an opportunity to enlarge and expand our horizons and getting to know wonderful colleagues. So in the interest of time, I will introduce our speakers for today. I'll introduce all of them, then we will start with their presentations, and then there will be a Q&A. I hope I can share my screen with you. Yeah, it seems that way. It works. You are going to see my email for a second. All right. So our first speaker today is going to be Catherine Sophia Bell, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Affiliate Faculty in African American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Pennsylvania State University. She is the founding director of the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers and the editor of Convergences, Black Feminism and Continental Philosophy, published in 2010, and the journal Critical Philosophy of Race. She's also the author of Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question, published in 2014. Then our next speaker after Catherine Bell is going to be Jose Cosa, who is Associate Professor in the College of Education at Pennsylvania State University. He is the author of Power, Politics, and Higher Education, International Regimes, Local Governments, and Educational Autonomy, as well as of African Renaissance and Higher Education, a view through the lenses of Christian higher education. Jose Cosa is the recipient of the 2012 Joyce Kane Award for Distinguished Research on People of African Descent and the co-founder of AI for Africa. Our third speaker is going to be Anand Bertrand-Commission, Professor of Political Science, California State University at Long Beach. He's a political theorist specializing in moral political philosophy and social movements. He is the author of Cosmopolitanism in Modernity, Human Dignity in a Global Age, published in 2011. His current project examines transnational cross-pollination in African diasporic political and economic movements, focusing specifically on the Anglo-Caribbean and the United States. Is also in the conference program committee for the Association for Political Theory 2019. And then last but not least, our fourth speaker is going to be Michael McBrain, visiting researcher at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights in Lund, Sweden. So joining us from Europe, I believe today, I'm not sure exactly where he is located at the moment. Co-founder of the European Network of People of African Descent. He is the author of Afro-Nordic Landscapes, Equality and Race in Northern Europe, published in 2014, and of Pan-Africanism and the African Diaspora in Europe that appeared in the Routledge Handbook of Pan-Africanism in 2020. And with that being said, I'll hand it over to Tiffany to give the word to our first speaker. Thanks.
Professor Bell, we are ready for you. And as long as we can get the view, just prioritizing her, that would be perfect. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the organizers, Tiffany, Ama, and Annalisa, as well as Aicre, for the invitation to participate in this important conversation. I also want to thank my fellow panelists and everyone who contributed to making this happen, and of course, all of the conference participants and attendees. If you follow me on social media at Catherine S. Bell, you've heard me introduce myself in the following way. Hello, I am Catherine Sophia Bell, founder and owner of La Bell Be Coaching, where I live and write and coach at the intersections of high achievers, happily unmarried, and erotic empowerment. My social media posts represent my lived experience, scholarship, and coaching at these intersections. Last year, I received a direct message from a graduate student and international student of color in philosophy who wrote, "Hello, Dr. Bell. I want to let you know that you have been a harbor for me in this philosophical wilderness. Your scholarship has been crucial to my dissertation project, and your thought and praxis, your holistic approach to the philosophical art of living, gives me hope that I may one day find a place in the academy to exist as myself." This is one of many encouraging and inspiring notes that remind me that I am on the right path in fulfilling my purpose, not only in my academic philosophical scholarship, but also with my integration of philosophy into the work that I do with La Bell Be Coaching. For the purposes of this panel discussion, I will focus on the former, including where I started, where I've been, and where I am going. So I want to start just with my education. I grew up for the most part in Montclair, New Jersey, a diverse town where I had a culturally rich and affirming experience being surrounded by Black excellence, from Black teachers to Black librarians, Black physicians, Black visual and performing artists, etc. I spent my 8th grade year in Jersey City Public Schools, at the time ranked the 2nd worst school district in the state and under state takeover. My mother, who had a master's in education and a law degree, worked as legal counsel for the district and believed that her children should attend the schools in which she worked. From there, she went to work for the Board of Education in a similar capacity in Trenton, New Jersey. Consequently, I went to Trenton Central High School, at that time ranked the 3rd worst public school district in the state of New Jersey. I finished high school early in 3 years at the age of 16. I went to Spelman College, where I started as a biology pre-med and pre-law major, wanting to do a JD/MD after college. But I did not have passion for biology, and I sought a new major. The philosophy department offered me the strongest argument for how it could prepare me both for medical school and for law school, and so I changed my major to philosophy. Spelman, of course, is a historically Black, small liberal arts college for women, where race, gender, class, and sexuality were almost always central to our philosophical inquiries, rather than marginal, invisible, or worse, deemed unphilosophical. I learned my senior year in college that there were only 16 Black women in the country at that time, this was the late 1990s, with a PhD in philosophy. I felt a moral and personal obligation to increase our representation in the discipline. I went to graduate school at the University of Memphis, where I founded the Ida B. Wells Philosophical Forum for undergraduate as well as graduate students of color, a program that is still running in Memphis and holds annual conferences inviting alumni back as speakers. In 2019, Beverly Guy Shefdahl, one of my former professors at Spelman College, and I were the keynote speakers for this conference organized by Lindsay Stewart, who earned her PhD in philosophy here at Penn State University. As a graduate student, I actively recruited Black students, mostly women, into that graduate program, which also had a lot of white women, though that often gets overlooked. Memphis was a unique place to do graduate studies in philosophy for a few reasons. Philosophically, it was a pluralistic program, emphasizing both analytic and continental traditions. And it was possible to leave with specializations from feminism and critical philosophy of race to epistemology to ethics to social and political philosophy. Most students left with some combination of the above. Memphis was also unique demographically because about half of the graduate students, sometimes more, were women, and a number of those women were Black. I got married and had 2 children while in graduate school and still finished my MA and PhD within 4 years. I remained in Memphis for a 1-year postdoctoral fellowship, during which time I taught courses in philosophy as well as African American and African studies. This would be followed by a second postdoctoral fellowship at Emory University's Center for Humanistic Inquiry. I received my first tenure track job in 2005 at Vanderbilt University with a primary appointment in African American and diaspora studies and a secondary appointment known there as a courtesy appointment in philosophy. I did some recruitment work for the philosophy department, though Vanderbilt was much more successful at recruiting white women than any men or women of color. If I'm remembering correctly, during my time there, which was about 2005 to 2008, they recruited 1 Black man and 1 Latina woman among mostly white men and women, among mostly white men and a few white women into the graduate program. It was at this very early stage in my career at Vanderbilt University that I founded the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers, or CBWP. CBWP is a philosophical organization launched in 2007, whose purpose is to encourage and foster a networking and mentoring relationship between the underrepresented Black women in philosophy, including graduate students and assistant, associate, and full professors in the academy. We later expanded to include undergraduate students because they were also constantly reaching out to me. The objective of CBWP is to mentor and retain the Black women who are currently professors or graduate students in philosophy, while simultaneously recruiting more Black women into the discipline. I was recruited to Penn State University in 2008. I accepted the offer because they had a strong commitment to diversifying the discipline of philosophy. I've stayed here for 12 years because they have demonstrated this commitment through admissions and placements for the last 12 years. I had a 3rd fellowship here, postdoctoral fellowship here, before starting my tenure track position. I also had 2 more children at Penn State before earning tenure, and I remain prolific in my publications, which include numerous articles and book chapters, an edited volume, a single authored book, and several books in progress. In addition to continuing to organize the CBWP conference, I also became a founding co-editor with Robert Bernasconi and Paul C. Taylor of the peer-reviewed journal Critical Philosophy of Race through Penn State University Press. I had the role of special editor and saw all of the articles through to publication for the inaugural issue in January of 2013 and several more issues after that. The inaugural issue theme, Critical Philosophy of Race Beyond the Black-White Binary, was inspired by a conference that I organized on the same topic in November of 2010. It featured contributors from major, contributions from major scholars in this research area, including Linda Martine Alcoff and Charles Mills, for example. For many years, I was also the director and conference organizer for Cultivating Underrepresented Students in Philosophy, or CUSP, a program designed to recruit traditionally underrepresented groups into philosophy. I've played a major role in other initiatives at Penn State, such as the Anna Julia Cooper Research Fellowship, a week in or week at Penn State designed to help develop or complete a publication, the Elaine Locke Postdoctoral Fellowship in Critical Philosophy of Race, and PIXI, or Philosophy in an Inclusive Key, a program hosted at Penn State with support from the Rock Ethics Institute, for which I have been a guest lecturer and offered workshops on surviving and thriving in graduate school. My first co-edited book, Convergences, Black Feminism and Continental Philosophy, was published by SUNY Press in 2010. My first single authored book, Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question, was published by Indiana University Press in 2014. I earned tenure at Penn State in 2015. And I like to say before the ink dried on my tenure letter, I was asked to step in as interim head of African American Studies during the 2015 and 2016 academic year. That was followed by a sabbatical and research leaves from fall 2016 to fall 2017. I'm currently holding several administrative positions at Penn State, including the interim director of the Africana Research Center, which I love. I'm also a peer coach for the Mid-Career Faculty Advancement Program, which I also love. And I am interim director of graduate studies, which I don't love, but agreed to do anyway. Still, I'm very intentional about protecting my time to finish my second single-authored book, Beauvoir and Bell, Critical Engagements with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, in which I critique the analogical approach to identity and oppression that she takes, the deployment of comparative and competing frameworks of oppression, as well as the ways in which women of color are either not engaged at all in some cases or problematically engaged in other cases in the text. My intention is to center the ways in which Black women and other women of color have engaged the second sex, while also offering a corrective to some of the exclusionary tendencies in the text and the replications of these exclusions in the scholarship on Beauvoir. My next two book projects focus first on Black feminism and Buddhism, and second on Black women's erotic empowerment. Hopefully this overview of my trajectory has given us some things to talk about and elaborate upon in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bell. Really appreciate your presence today and for you sharing your exemplary record. It's really quite lovely to hear about the whole journey. I will next welcome our speaker, Professor Jose Costa.
Hello, everyone. So I'm just gonna, I'm original from Mozambique, and that's, very brief introduction. And hopefully, if you have any questions at some point, please do feel free to ask me. But I'm just gonna go straight to what I am here to say as far as this topic is concerned. So in the last, the last decade and a half, there seems to be a revival of African intellectual quest for defining both philosophy and education in a way that makes sense, at least, to the African intelligentsia, by challenging the dominant pre-existing notions of the essence of both philosophy and education. But in order to engage in a quest that will lead to a meaningful transformation towards both philosophy and education, such a quest needs to be rooted in scholarly engagements that look critically at epistemology, since scholarship is about how we know what we know without overlooking ontology and axiology as they are threaded in ways that we cannot unthread with epistemology. So consequently, amidst these developments and concurrent conundrum, one may ask, should Africans and the rest of the non-Western world be thinking in terms of a philosophy of X, Y, or Z? Is the nature of Ubuntu compatible with the nature of philosophy? So any attempt to answer these questions calls for a consideration of the very basic conceptions of philosophy. That is, philo equals love, Sophia equals wisdom. And a look at how wisdom might be understood in humanism and Ubuntu. If we assume that wisdom, lato sensu, is a manifestation in Ubuntu world, and consequently the love of such, is there compatibility between how wisdom, stricto sensu, is thought of within a humanist world and within Ubuntu? Now, in humanist thinking, wisdom is centered around the individual's human abilities to make decisions about daily life matters. When it operates within the context of education, then it seems to focus on the ability to offer a sophisticated logic, perhaps linear, endowed with cumulative insight based on other humans' thinking when making such decisions. That's the use of references. It does not seem far-fetched to argue that non-Western contexts might offer alternative decision-making sophistications that are not compatible with such Western wisdom. For instance, in biblical ancient world, wisdom is equated with a fear of God, and is personified as God or coexisting with God, perhaps as a means to construct it as a God originating rather than human originating phenomenon. Now, in Ubuntu world, wisdom can only be centered on the embodying of the motto Moto Kimoto Gabatu, or Umuntu Gumuntu Gabantu. That is a person unto or because or through persons, not as an African conception of self, but as the essence of humanity in its humanness. While in Ubuntu, wisdom is the realization that one is only if fellow persons are. In humanism, one is because one thinks. Thus, the Descartes syllogism, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, is compatible with and central to humanism, but it is incompatible with and exterior to Ubuntu. For instance, Descartes claimed to have found the first principle of philosophy, and that such a principle allowed him to develop the Cartesian logic, which constitutes the heart of humanism and attests to the decision-making process in conceptualizing and understanding the essence of being human. Now, in Cartesian terms, the mind discovered itself, defined itself, and made sense of itself and the life it leads. This, in contrast to the body, which is rendered almost meaningless in regards to understanding existence. In Ubuntu world, as opposed to humanist world, existence is not reduced to thought, but to the perception of being that is contingent on and inseparable from fellow humans. However, or moreover, Ubuntu focuses on the whole being and manifests in the communal known in Swahili as ujamaa, whereas humanism focuses on the creative power of the human brain and manifests in the individual. While in Ubuntu, a community is not made of individuals because the perception of individual is absent. In Ubuntu world, individuals comprise community in humanism. Now, I argue that for the absence of individual in Ubuntu, using as a premise the motto itself, an African spiritual cosmologies. So let me reiterate. When translated literally, the motto means a person is a person unto persons, thus rendering both the singular and the othering obsolete by not allowing the definition of personhood through self or individuality. African cosmologies, on the other hand, presuppose that at no point is the physical entity, often known as the self in humanism, alone, given that our ancestors are always with us in the real world and daily affairs. So Tiffany's recognition of the ancestors here is very much a part of this cosmology, a reflection of it. African civilizations ought to be understood against the backdrop of an understanding of a human being as being with inherent dignity and how that dignity was reduced through complex systematic efforts to denigrate others in order to dominate. For instance, oral historians tell us when European settlers encountered Africans in the Southern African region who presumably had immigrated from the Great Lakes region in Central Africa, the Europeans asked, who are you? And the response of the people in the Africans then was that we are humans or people, Bantu. Now, this descriptor was seen by Europeans as a descriptor of a particular people who were thenceforth referred to by the senseless descriptor Bantu people, which literally means people. And in this historical narrative of the encounter between Africa and the West, assuming that historians are accurate in their recounting of such encounter, a foundational distinction can be made in the understanding of human between one who operates within an Ubuntu framework and one who operates within a humanistic framework. Therefore, when taking this narrative seriously into account, as I do here, one can argue that when the Africans in the narrative describe themselves as Bantu, they're defining humanity in its more global way without imposing universalism. We are human. On the contrary, the Europeans in the narrative, informed by their humanistic orientation, saw this as a mere description of a particular group of people. So what emerged out of this was a perpetual embracing of an erroneous categorization of the people, Southern African people with specific features. And one important point here to highlight is that African scholars included have embraced and sustained this descriptor without cognizance of the cognitive system and the corresponding epistemological root, which is humanism, that informs such a descriptor. Now, the dilemma found in the dominance of humanism over other epistemology in conceptualizing personhood have been inherited by African scholars and present an almost insurmountable challenge for those of us who are seeking to illuminate the world about the possibility of elevating African cognition and epistemology to equitable levels in global scholarship and practice. Like African Renaissance literature, African and diasporic post-colonial literature wrestled with the issue of finding adequate expressions of humanity as a form of liberation from colonialism. However, such attempts fell short of the stronghold of humanism, albeit constituting an indispensable foundation on which to build the quest for African epistemological independence and the grounds for equitable epistemological participation in global discourse. Despite the noble role played by post-colonial thinkers in conceptualizing the essence of humanity, the entrapping power of epistemology inherent in humanism and its misappropriation as a global instrument to define humanity prevails. Even scholars with a very keen eye to catching the nuances of epistemological subjugation in times fall prey of such in their analysis. So in conclusion, acknowledging and scrutinizing the intricacy of epistemological subjugation and incommensurability of humanism on Ubuntu is only one of the starting points towards a formulation of comprehensive arguments and salient the distinct and independent nature of Ubuntu. It is important, and it's in fact, it's only one of the starting points towards this formulation, comprehensive arguments to salient the distinction and independent nature of Ubuntu, but also its importance and also its contribution to the global philosophical landscape. So Ubuntu has provided Black people, a lot of a tool for resilience, even when we are not aware of its manifestation in our own lives. It is now time to recall, to reconstruct, and to continue to engage our ancestral wisdom and liberate it from the yoke of humanism. And that, my dear friends, is my final call. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Costa. Very, very grateful to have you share with us your insistence that it is time for us to maybe have a slower approach to understanding how Ubuntu is informing our practice. So thank you very, very much. I'll now welcome Professor Commission.
Thank you, Tiffany. Well, thank you all, and in particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Willoughby Herard and the Africana Institute for Creation, Recognition, and Elevation, and the Philosophy Department for inviting us all here today. I also want to thank my fellow panelists, and I've already learned so much, so I can only hope to do half as much as they've contributed so far. So in preparing these remarks for today, as a scholar and theorist of politics, and here I just wanted to emphasize for my colleagues in philosophy that I am not a political scientist, although that is my degree. I'm really a theorist. My mind immediately focused on political institutions and practices outside the academy. But upon further reflecting on the invitation, I realized that our focus today might also be on our practices and assumptions and training in the academy, and more specifically in our classes. Of course, the political and social institutions beyond do come to bear, but in our bizarre medieval institution whose practices and assumptions go back centuries in the world, and here I include learning practices and institutions in Africa, in Europe and Middle East, I realized I ought to speak more specifically about our roles as academics, at least in the beginning. It's precisely because the academy has always been in the world, even when it was strictly speaking a clerical training ground, that we must be aware of our role in the world. There are two reasons I've found for, in my experiences in the academy, for demanding equity and inclusion in our methods, our curricula, and our institutions. First, as producers of knowledge about a diverse world, our scholarship needs to reflect and speak to the realities of that world. The university, the quote unquote university, or madrasa, as these names imply, are places where higher study of the whole world takes place. Thus, as inheritors of these traditions, we should fulfill that imperative. Second, we are also responsible for training and teaching those who come after us. As students come to us with diverse backgrounds and skills, our responsibility is to engage them as we engage the world. I'm choosing to focus on what we do in the classroom, but it should be clear that the classroom is related to our scholarship and vice versa. Let's not sugarcoat it. The university is an elite institution. So to begin with, there's a class issue that's involved with universities. But more to our focus today, while the university has a history that precedes the world that we currently inhabit, the modern Western world that we currently inhabit for most of us, it also grew up in a world that was deeply suffused with white supremacy. And so it has become implicated in those knowledge productions, those reproducing of itself, its role in shaping external institutions that are deeply white supremacist. And so the challenge that we have is to, in the classroom, so I notice I'm going back and forth there between outside world and classroom. The challenge that we have in the classroom then, at least as far as I can see it, is to confront that world and also our role as an academy and academicians in the sustenance and the reproduction of that world. Now, probably when we do the philosophy department discussion, we'll talk, I'm quite happy to talk about some of the strategies that I've used to try and combat this. And it's related to my own research, but also my service that I do both in the university and outside. So as it's usually the case with faculty of color, almost half of my service work is dealing with issues of students of color, gender and sexual minorities, migration, all of those non-white, non-heteronormative practices and policies of our academy. Part of the reason for that is because, as Catherine pointed out, students come to us and they're able to give us feedback about what our universities are doing. So that was at this university and my previous university. That was often the role that I played. It was even more so at my last university because it was not only was it a PWI, it was also in a very, very rural part of Texas. So it wasn't even a rural part of California, it was a rural part of Texas. So you do the politics of how people voted in that area, now you know the kinds of trauma that our students students of color experienced in those contexts. Part of the reason for the move here, but no, we don't need to talk about that yet, my move to California. So in the classroom itself, one of the challenges that I've found, so my training is, I was listening to Catherine talking about her training in at both undergrad and graduate, and that seemed so joyous to me. But my training was white continental theory. That was the closest that I could find in my program to be able to address the kinds of concerns that I had about race, about gender, about sexuality, about immigration, all of those. It was largely continental philosophy, and continental political theory that I sought to address in my scholarship and my experience in academia. But it was largely white thinkers. So one of the things that I've, over the last about 10 years, so I've been out of graduate school since I graduated in 2005. And what I've been doing over the last 10 years, so you see there's a little gap there, over the last 10 years is to try and the scholarship that I was doing outside of the classroom, to bring that into the classroom. And the reason why that may seem like a normal thing to do, it wasn't, because part of what I was tasked with was teaching the tradition, so teaching the canon. So the question was, how do I bring that the research that I was doing outside from my scholarship into teaching the canon? And so I've been, over the last 10 years or so, been more and more integrating that in, and we can talk about how each one of us do that given our responsibilities in teaching and training future scholars. So one of the main challenge there is the combination responsibility to teach about white supremacy and the world that it has created, and also the challenges to that. Oftentimes for me, that occurs in just one class. So I'm teaching the canon and also the challenges and critiques of the canon in the same term, as opposed to multiple terms. And that's just those are just some of the limitations of what I get to teach, because I don't teach in a theory department. I teach in a political science department, so I have to teach political science. But even there, that political science, the dry kind of political science that I'm responsible for, that is the American national government, I can certainly bring in scholarship from racial, sexual, immigrant scholars into that class. But again, the responsibility there is to do the dry, this is the Constitution. Of course, the Constitution itself is a white supremacist document, so showing how that's the case, that's also part of the challenge. So what I would like to get out of this, and what I hope to talk about more when we're talking amongst ourselves, is how we do that parallel track. Try to show students how it is that this white supremacist world came into being, and then also challenge it at the same time. All right, and I will stop right there.
Thank you so much, Professor Comisiong, for that really detailed discussion on pedagogy and the significance of attending to pedagogy. I'll welcome now Professor Aicre.
Thank you, Tiffany. Good evening, everyone. It's 1946 here in Sweden. Yes, it's an honor to be taking part in this critical dialogue on the relationship between philosophy and African and Black life. And I commend you, Tiffany, as the School of Humanities Equity Advisor, the Africana Institute for Creativity, Recognition and Elevation, and the Department of Philosophy at UCI for making this happen. I've decided to call this brief presentation Philosophy for What and Who, which I believe is a critical but not widely asked question for philosophy to ask itself. This is true of philosophy in general, not least when considering the increased emphasis at UCI and other universities on being socially responsible, relevant, and engaged. Moreover, with respect to the theme of this webinar, it is true regarding the relevance of race racial justice and equity to American philosophy and universities writ large. To directly address the specific context of this lecture series, including today's webinar, I will use the Department of Philosophy at UCI and the vision, mission, and strategic pillars of UCI of equity, inclusion, and social service as a reference point. Not to put the Department of Philosophy and UCI per se on the spot, but as examples that are both directly relevant and illustrative of broader issues across the US and other parts of the world. The vision, mission, and strategic pillars of UCI reflect, as they should, the guiding values and principles of the university. For instance, the first strategic pillar of UCI calls for research that makes a difference in the world in how we look at and act in it. The second pillar calls on the university to enrich the minds and spirits of its students, prepare them for productive lives, and empower them to make the strongest possible contributions to our world. Whereas the third pillar calls on the university to, in an inclusive manner, service, engage, and collaborate with the community. The fourth pillar is mostly concerned with the financial and institutional sustainability of the university. In recognition of the centrality of higher education in producing and reproducing a knowledge-based society, the social responsibilities of universities, perhaps especially of public universities funded by taxpayers, as well as the growing demands, in my mind, legitimate demands, but for reasons I'll mention seldom not consequential ones, for research to have a social impact, be available to the public, and ethically responsible. The avowed objectives of UCI are indeed excellent ones. However, their successful attainment requires a form of self-reflection, which I dare say is rare in academia, or at least typically not considered fundamental to it. That is, reflecting on the social values of research, questions and topics, if and how they, so to speak, quote unquote, make a difference, where, when, and to whom. To what extent UCI practices what it preaches and makes sure that such reflections are an integral and fundamental part of its knowledge production and curriculum, I do not know. However, I would be as delighted as I would be surprised if such practices actually are mainstreamed at UCI, maybe even are requirements for researchers, faculty, and teaching, and subject to reporting and monitoring. Of the endless amount of research questions and topics that you could have chosen, why did you choose this one? Do you have an idea why and how it might be of value to people? Whereas such questions may be considered existentially fundamental to pursuits of knowledge, it is arguably not a part of mainstream academic culture to be in the habit of asking them. The reasons for this may be many and are open to speculation. For example, in part, it may be due to ideals of science as value neutral or value free, even in its motivations and possible applications. Ideals of academic freedom, where researchers and students should be free to pursue any knowledge they want, irrespective of whatever values may or may not be ascribed to it, perhaps as long as it's not directly harmful. And the idealization of academic research as inherently of high value, not least canonized thinkers and subjects, as in the case in philosophy, which perhaps more than any other academic discipline is based on intellectual canonization. However, as widespread as the unwillingness in academia may be to have ongoing conversations around the values of knowledge pursuits, such unwillingness is untenable given the social embeddedness, power, and importance of universities and research institutions, not to mention the avowed objectives of a university such as UCI. Regarding philosophy, be it at UCI or elsewhere, we need to begin asking ourselves what its questions and topics are for, who and what they serve, and how. This is not merely critical to the social efficacy of philosophy in general, but to a philosophy that is mindful of how it may or may not be of value and to whom, including how it may or may not be racially inclusive and flexible enough to address the needs of anyone, irrespective of their racial, ethnic, cultural, or national background, and / or whatever socially salient needs there may be with respect to such backgrounds. What I am calling for here is a philosophy that does not seek to increase its quote unquote diversity merely by adding it onto the curriculum and faculty, as it were, but to treat such aspirations as integral to an open-ended process of striving to be socially relevant and significant. This will also mean opening up to a willingness to discuss the social values of even the most canonized philosophical interests and topics without taking the value of any of it for granted. Besides the value of having social value, as well as being socially equitable, unless we do this, we run the risk of conceiving of white European philosophy as the real, undoubtedly important, and even universal philosophy against which non-white European philosophies are to be measured, judged, and included as an addition in the name of diversity, or excluded as irrelevant and or substandard. This risk is real in contemporary American philosophy, where there is a growing recognition of the need to give room to non-white European philosophies such as Africana, Asian, Native / Indigenous American, and Latin American philosophies. In many US philosophy departments, you will now find quote unquote non-Western philosophy included in the curriculum, either with alternative non-Western views on a given topic, such as the nature of the mind or religion, as seems to be the case at UCI, and or as freestanding courses, such as a course on so-called Asian philosophy, as also seems to be the case at UCI, sometimes taught by professors who specialize in a given non-Western philosophy. In addition, it is becoming increasingly popular in the US to recognize the need to include the philosophy of race as well as gender as subject areas of research and teaching. In the case of UCI, philosophy of gender seems to be included in the curriculum, but not race. Albeit these developments towards diversifying philosophy, as it were, are small steps towards creating a philosophy that is socially equitable, inclusive, and valuable, it will by default not go all the way in creating such philosophy. What I'm calling for here is similar to, but broader than, calls in some pockets of contemporary American philosophy to decolonize it. According to such calls, mainstream American philosophy needs to question its Eurocentric interests, curricular design and contents, its universal and equal relevance to all human beings, its lack of persons of color in its faculties and reading lists, its absence of interrogating its contributions to racist ideas and practices, and its lack of engagement with the particular situations, experiences, and traditions of people of color. All this strikes me as true and fair. However, I would add that at heart / fundamentally, this has to do with developing a philosophy that is socially relevant, significant, and equitable. To achieve this can be a painstaking process, especially if one is of the view that white European philosophy is of indisputable and supreme value as it is, without any further need for discussion or qualification. On the other hand, if one is willing to admit that at the very least, the indisputable and supreme value of white European philosophy might need to be explained, then we may have the beginning of a much needed conversation. For such a conversation to be open and truthful, we may need to face some truths that may be experienced as hard or otherwise uncomfortable. For example, we may want to ask ourselves what it says about the UCI Department of Philosophy, its practice of philosophy, and perhaps American philosophy in general, that although it is nearly gender equal, it seems to be all white or nearly all white. What has made it possible for a university on former Aicre and Tongva ancestral lands at the Pacific Ocean near the US-Mexican border in a highly racially and ethnically diverse state with a high percentage of Hispanics to not have any of this reflected in its faculty, research interests, or curriculum, but at the same time be an international pan-European faculty with members from the US, Germany, Italy, and the UK. You may find, or at least be willing to carefully consider, that this state of affairs is connected to histories and legacies of colonialism, racialized oppression, and exclusion. You may also find that in order to be socially responsible and relevant to the context of UCI, its students and communities, considering such histories and legacies should be reflected in your efforts to develop the department. The ethos of such reflections that I'm calling for here may be described in terms of the Xhosa and Zulu term Ubuntu, to stress the social values and aspects of knowledge production in ways that honors our social and environmental interconnectedness. A shout out here to my fellow panelist, Jose Cosa. The urgency of developing knowledge, curriculums, and global citizens that speak to our social and environmental interconnectedness can hardly be overstated. The reflections that I'm calling for here are also similar to the American pragmatism of John Dewey and William James. Although not wedded to Jewish assumption that the genuine source of philosophical reflection is social difference principle, that the values or significances of knowledge pursuits is the difference they make to our lives and societies, I agree that reflecting on the social values of philosophy and other academic knowledge production should be integral to it. And in addition, that this needs to be done by carefully examining the roles and topics may play in our lives as a way of examining what they may or may not mean to us, how, when, and to whom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Aicre. I really, really appreciate all of you. And we're going to take a few moments to have a discussion among the panelists. I know that Professors Ray and Koliva probably have many questions, but since I'm sitting in the chair's seat, I will offer my couple of questions first, and we'll answer them in a bank. I will give us about 20 minutes for our Q&A time discussion, and then we'll switch over as much indulgence as our specific time, as close as you can get until there, for a conversation that again is a closed conversation with members of the philosophy department. You don't have to say how long you can stay right now, but if it's possible for you to stay till that time, we would very much appreciate it. And that will be a conversation facilitated by Professor Koliva until 11:30 So the first 10 minutes of the conversation by the chair of the philosophy department, then the following 30 minutes by Professor Aaron James. Okay, so my questions, I said, are, I'm gonna go right ahead with them. Annalisa, yes, absolutely. I see it. Thank you very much. Okay, so this bank of questions. Professor Bell, I'm really curious about how you managed to do this recruitment work of women of color while also a graduate student, and why you did that, what you thought the benefit of doing that was to your own training as a philosopher. I'm also curious about why you presented your scholarly work by describing your own intellectual journey, like what the relationship between that is and your practice of philosophy. I'm also really interested, Professor Kosa, about what you help us understand about the ways that Ubuntu sometimes shows up unconsciously in the lives of people of African descent, but also in the ways that it becomes incorporated into systems of humanism in ways that are kind of represented back in ways that are actually harmful and antithetical to the kind of roots of what Ubuntu is trying to do. I'm curious, Professor Commission, about why feedback from students is so important to you, why you prioritize that. And that kind of feeds me into Professor Aicre's set of questions and his very systematic kind of assessment. I think in many ways, you know, departments, when they do their external evaluations, you know, people would pay millions of dollars to be able to have the kind of systematic analysis, especially by someone who does this kind of analysis for global organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank and CARICOM. So first of all, I want to thank you, Professor, for taking the time to really do such a systematic reading back and forth between the mission of the university and the mission of the philosophy department, and kind of in an incredibly generous way, walking us through articulating what the vision could look like. So my question for you is just, you know, where do you get off offering people an honest assessment? Where did you cultivate, you know, what set of ethics do you come from that enable you to do that kind of work as a philosopher? So I've offered you 4 questions, and you'll just please be patient with me, panelists, for giving you a whole bank of questions, and then we'll have a conversation that way. I am being mindful of the time, so you do not have to worry about that. There's a question from Hélène Nascimento. To all the speakers, in the past, Greek philosophy was the foundation of mathematics, logic, reasoning, and scientific methods. How do other philosophical narratives influence science now? Professor Koliva, can you unmute yourself so you can ask your question as well?
So mine is not really a question, it's more just a very short follow-up on the last panelists' intervention. I think that what was said was very, very fair and engaging in many ways. There may be things that as a department we have been trying to do which are not yet quite apparent. For instance, we do have, after all, a course on gender and race that has just been approved, so it will be offered starting next year. And it's true that as a department we are trying to pursue more hirings also in, you know, of scholars interested in let's say African American philosophy, widely construed, as well as in Latinx. Sometimes, you know, but that's also the case that it takes time, it takes resources, and maybe they are, you know, nothing happens as quickly as one might want it. And so we are in the business of doing all that. So I wanted just to point that out to give a fuller picture of what we have been trying to do as a department. Of course, I'll be happy to see all these requests of FTEs authorized very quickly, so that we can make real progress in the next year or two. The situation also due to the pandemic might be a little bit more complicated, but we have our eyes on the ball, as it were. Right, thanks.
All right, so panelists, please feel free to jump right in. And I want to remind people who are in the audience, if you'd be kind enough to add your question to the Q&A in the second round of questions, we will get to them.
Okay, this is Catherine. I'll go ahead and jump in. So your first question was about me as a graduate student doing recruitment. And so I will say, I love philosophy at Spelman College. Again, I was, my joyous philosophical training, as it was described, allowed me to take seriously race, class, gender, sexual orientation, those kinds of questions in any kind of philosophy class I was taking. It didn't have to be a feminist philosophy class, like whether we were reading Aristotle or Kant or whomever, we always centered race, class, and gender in the conversation. I think a lot of that had to do with being at a historically Black women's college, right? Small liberal arts college. So that was what philosophy was for me. And because I loved it so much and decided to pursue it in graduate school, again, like when I found out in the 90s, there were only 16 Black women in the country with a PhD in philosophy, I felt a moral and personal obligation to increase our representation in the discipline. And that is what really motivated me to go to graduate school in philosophy, but also to recruit more Black women into the discipline, which I started as early as graduate school. One of the important things about graduate students being able to play this kind of role is the reason that Memphis was so good at recruiting Black women in the department. And the reason why Penn State is also so good at that is because we don't have this kind of trickle in mentality of like, let in one Black student per year per cohort and see how they do. And if they do well, then we'll maybe let another one in next year, right? The majority of our cohort is students of color. So when students are thinking about where they want to go, if they're looking at your average predominantly white institution with a PhD program in philosophy where there are no or only one Black student, and they look at Penn State, or at the time when I was at the University of Memphis, they look at Memphis, they see that, it's not this kind of, one person trickle in kind of approach to recruiting. So in other words, students who are doing well and flourishing, if you have students of color who are doing well and flourishing in the PhD program in a department, it encourages other students to come there because they know they're coming into a safer space or a more welcoming environment, right? Does that mean that Memphis was without its issues? No. Does that mean Penn State is without its issues? No. But how I tend to describe Penn State is it's a more hospitable and less hostile environment for students of color who want to do philosophy. Penn State is also a space where you can specialize in critical philosophy of race. You can specialize in like Black and Latina feminism, right? So you're not coming in trying to make the case for why this is important. Our distribution requirements require students to take a critical philosophy of race course or a feminist course or a world philosophy course, right? Not just a kind of Plato, Aristotle, history of philosophy kind of course. So that's a long way of saying one of the reasons why I was active in recruiting is because I really did want to increase the representation of Black women in the discipline, and Memphis was a space where I thought Black women could flourish as graduate students, and now Penn State is a space where that can also happen. You also mentioned or asked about just some of my previous experiences and how that connects with my research agenda. So I have always been from my youth in really supportive Black communities and environments where I was encouraged to, thrive, not just to survive, but also to thrive. And so because that was such a part of my lived experience, really up until Spelman College, once, being in a historically Black institution, once I went to a predominantly white institution, I recognized that if those spaces weren't already there, then I would have to create them. So I have always been about the business of either finding communities that are going to be supportive for me, or if they don't exist, then creating those communities. So that is why I started the Ida B. Wells organization when I was at Memphis. That's why I started Collegium of Black Women Philosophers when I was at Vanderbilt, and have continued to do that. And so one of the powerful things about creating those kinds of spaces is students of color can come together and do philosophy without dealing with imposter syndrome, without dealing with people questioning whether or not their questions or their projects are philosophical, right? So when a Black woman comes to CBWP, she can go to the front of the room and assert herself as an expert without somebody questioning, who is she, and is this really philosophical? Like everyone in the room takes for granted she's an expert in her field. Everyone in the room takes for granted that her project is philosophical because she said so, right? And my kind of benchmark for what constitutes something being philosophical, you can use like the pre-Socratic fragments. My thing is, if Thales' water is philosophy, then anything goes, right? Don't be a gatekeeper about what constitutes what's philosophical. So there is a connection between looking at those communities that have been really encouraging to me, and then the kinds of philosophical projects I've engaged in. So like with my first book on Hannah Arendt, I got tired of being in places where people were talking about Arendt as like the one person in the Western philosophical canon who got it, who was not racist, who was pluralistic, who got everything right. And it's just like, no, like with the exception of the Little Rock essay, right? So part of the point of my book on Hannah Arendt is like the philosophical framework that's operating in the Little Rock essay is consistent across her writings, you know, and that's what I show in that book. So it's one of those books that I've read and I wonder, why are people so taken with this person who has similar racist issues as other people in the canon? And how do it was the book, you know, as Toni Morrison says, right? It's the book that I wanted to read that hadn't been written, so I wrote it. And I do a similar thing with this Simone de Beauvoir book, right? There have been so many Black women and other women of color that have engaged the second sex that get completely ignored in the secondary literature. So the purpose of that project is to show how Black women and women of color have engaged that text and bring visibility to them.
Others, feel free to jump in, please. Thank you so much.
I suppose I could jump ahead of Jose, if you don't mind, Jose, because this actually, your question, Tiffany, speaks to something that Catherine is expressing. So why are students so important to me? And I think part of the reason is for me to figure out how to bring my research, my scholarship into that class where I'm teaching the Greeks, for example. One of the impulses to do that was seeing my classes and wondering why there are no at my last university, why there are no specifically Black students. Now, my last university, it was actually an HSI, although it was a PWI HSI. That's a strange combination. It was a Hispanic, technically speaking, it was a Hispanic serving institution, but it had all the trappings of a PWI. And so that was my initial impulse was, why there are not more Black students in my classes. The major was really small, political science was really small. So one of the ways that I thought to do that was to bring my scholarship into the class, but also I realized that students need to be exposed to this as well. So it was a way of me working out ideas that I was struggling with in my research, and also doing the thing that I had been demanding of the university where I was, and now where I am now, that is to diversify the curriculum itself. And so so when we talk more directly to like I said, talk more directly to the philosophy department, there are ways to do that. So yeah.
Thank you. Jose or Michael, please feel free to jump right in.
Jose, please, you go first.
I was actually thinking the same thing. You go, and then I'll go. But I just simply probably say that both my colleagues, Catherine and Anand, did a phenomenal job and in translating this and responding to this question. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about it, except to say that part of the challenge for us is, as Michael has, very cogently pointed out, the problem is very deep. And it's very difficult to deal with some of the structures and change a lot of things in so many ways. And so I always say that we have to walk in 100% woke, because the system in which we're operating does not sleep. I tell my students that modernity does not sleep. It's a colonizing system, and it's going to always do like 24/7 work to colonize. So as people are walking through this system, we have to stay constantly woke, even if it's just one eye open or so. and do this by, embodying the principles that we have learned, we have inherited from our ancestors, and in the classroom, interactions with students, and try to, the best textbook there is probably our own practice as professors, as administrators, as scholars, and so on and so on. And perhaps that's one of the best things that they can, if they see it embodied and they see the resilience embodied in us, perhaps they get inspiration to continue on the journey. But if we are sellouts and begin to act like this is the only way you can do is by assimilation, as Michael talked about the inclusion aspect, we don't question those that effort to include. Inclusion to what? We don't ask those questions even in front of our students. We don't boldly take those kinds of steps. They'll just think this is the way to do. It's just be assimilated, and this is what a Black professor looks like. They just different skin, but nothing else is different. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Jose. Yes, so I think I had two questions. The first one was from you, Tiffany. What kind of ethics do I come from? And yes, so I'm not sure that I understand the question correctly, but and I mean a lot can be said about this. Could you maybe before I answer it, rather than guessing, could you maybe ask the question again in a different way, or elaborate on what you mean by the question? What kind of ethics do I come from?
It says the host has spotlighted my video. Okay, all right, I got it. This thing that Jose just said that was so compelling to me is that it's not simply to have a Black professor means nothing, right? It's not just another skin showing up in the room. And it's also not some universal essence that is always going to be something else. But there is something else that's being brought to the table. Maybe it's like the question that's being raised in the Q&A by Maria Elena Gaitan, who says, can we even reflect on the fact that, the civil rights movement occurred in the 1960s, and yet race in the philosophy department and the environmental relationship that UCI has to historically racist and segregated Orange County, where it's located. These are things that the Black professoriate seems committed, regardless of the consequences or cost to us individually or personally, committed to raising that set of questions. And for me, that's an ethical burden. It's an ethical weight. It's a set of practices that not everybody takes up. And yet when we do find ourselves in places and we decide, you know what, it's not okay that this department doesn't represent the actual gender numbers of students in this community, I'm gonna fix that, right? I'm gonna do something about that. I'm gonna be courageous about that. So I wanted to signal and invite you to say more about the field of knowledge and the imaginaries that you come from that make you possible to say things that other people will not say.
All right.
In a minute.
Within a minute. Yes. Yes. So thank you, Tiffany. And yeah, maybe I can address both your question and maybe Annalisa's comment and also Jose's comment. Let me begin with Jose's by saying that it would be a terrible misunderstanding to assume that what I'm advocating for is a simple assimilation. Couldn't be further from the truth. The point of, and an important point, and this is also a comment on Annalisa's comment, I think, which I said in my presentation, that this sort of add-on diversity, which I think is pretty common these days that, we need to recognize diversity somehow, we need to be more inclusive. So let's have a course in Asian philosophy. Let's have another course on race and gender, which you said is forthcoming. Let us hire a person in Latinx or African American philosophy. And, then we get to a point where then we have done our job, right? We have enough hires, we have maybe better representation, and then we've done our job. And so my point is precisely that is, far from sufficient if we want to have a department and a university that is socially equitable, but also a university that is, aligned with its avowed objectives, and that is as socially relevant and significant as it can be. I don't think that, merely having a sort of add-on diversity is sufficient. So, is going back to Jose's point, this is my point is precisely one of saying that mere assimilation is not sufficient. So with respect to my ethics and what informs these sorts of perspectives, of course, I'm someone that is schooled in post-colonial studies, and also someone with a background where I have my father from Tobago, and who grew up during British colonialism and so forth, and we also have experiences and have been told things and so on and so forth that also, of course, inform my sense of the world and so forth. But yes, there's a lot to be said about like the ethics and so on, and the justice aspect, and promoting dignity without any sort of exclusion, but also in a way where we need to maybe also in some ways, as Fanon would put it, call forth a new humanism, or new human, if you will. So that is also, I think, very much a part of my ethical outlook.
I saw that Catherine and Anand, Prof. Bell and Commission had comments, and if I can give you all each the floor to respond for 1 minute, and I think then we'll go over by 11:30 to the small group.
Yeah, so I was just going to jump in really quickly about how we approach teaching our courses. So for example, if I'm teaching a history of philosophy course, I don't start with the Greeks. I start with Chinese philosophy, and then I go to Egyptian philosophy, and then I go to Greek philosophy to show that philosophy didn't actually start with the Greeks. People were doing, this false narrative of philosophy starting with the Greeks and then somehow just staying in Europe is a problematic narrative that gets reinforced when we teach history of philosophy classes in that way. So I don't teach a history of philosophy class in that way. Even when I'm teaching, for example, a European philosophy seminar, graduate seminar, I'm teaching Richard Wright, I'm teaching Aimé Césaire, I'm teaching Frantz Fanon, I'm teaching the Nardal sisters, right? And part of the question is, okay, who and or what is Europe and European philosophy, right? Like when we look at Europe's colonial history, do we count Césaire and Fanon and our Nardal sisters, or Richard Wright, who became a French citizen? Like, why can't we teach them in a European philosophy seminar, right? So I don't just teach white Europeans, even if the course is called European philosophy, right? Like I disrupt the narrative or the assumptions that go into even the titling and the descriptions of the courses. So that's one thing, so that I think that speaks to this, not just kind of adding on, but what does it mean to really take seriously disrupting, the narratives around how courses are constructed, how they're named, and things like that. One other point I want to make is that I don't think, so in terms of the assimilation thing, right? Like one of the things that I really emphasize in CBWP, and I think this is important, even what we're talking about in terms of the classroom environment, is if you are a Black woman and you do Black feminism and you do critical philosophy of race and that's what you want to talk about, great. if you're a Black woman and you're a Kant scholar or you're a Hume scholar and that's what you want to talk about, that's also great. So I try to really trouble this operating assumption that your philosophy should also be your identity or your identity should be your philosophy. So I just want to leave space for that for people who don't necessarily want to teach in critical philosophy of race or feminism or whatever the case may be, but they love, for whatever reason, they love insert traditional Western philosophical figure. I think it's important to leave space for people to do that thing in addition to these other things that we do.
So Catherine, I was that student, the Kant student. So, but then I've more recently, so in my training, that's what I was interested in. But then I realized part of the problem was that I did not have, say, for example, Michael's post-colonial training. That none of my faculty members did that. So that's why I started to supplement the Kant stuff with more post-colonial research. So one of the things I just wanted to point to is, so in my remarks, I was talking about our responsibilities as scholars and then also our responsibilities as teachers. And it occurred to me that in PWIs or Eurocentric departments or universities, that is also technically what their ethos is. So our colleagues might be saying, yes, I am interested in describing the world and analyzing the world accurately. And I'm also interested in training those who come after us. But as Maria Elena, her question kind of underscores, is what is your worldview that produces a curriculum that is completely white, for example, or Eurocentric? If you're trying to reflect and analyze the real world, look at the actual material that you're teaching or that your scholarship is. That was part of my move from Kant or inclusion of post-colonial thinking in with Kant. I was starting to realize, listen, you are literally talking about white people only. That's a problem. That has to be a problem because the world is not white. So you can't try to address the problems of a white supremacist world by only looking at white scholars. And so I just wanted to bring in our colleagues by showing that the larger dynamic that I was trying to articulate at the beginning about what we do at the university, you still need to, as many of the panelists, my fellow panelists have been saying, despite that you might share that ethos, you have to interrogate how you are fulfilling that ethos as well. So
I want to give everybody the opportunity, to thank our incredible panelists for this wide-ranging and incredibly systematic and thoughtful and vulnerable presentation. And we are making our transition now to the in-house conversation, which, as I said, will be facilitated partially by Professor Koliva, maybe for 35 seconds because she has to go on, but probably primarily by Professor James. Professor Ray or Koliva, do you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to share? No, okay. All right, well, thank you everyone who joined us who's not a member of the philosophy department. Professor Koliva has given me a list of the faculty members and lecturers and affiliates, and I've passed those on to Dwayne Pack. And so if you are on that list, you will be moved over. Professor Ray, it looks like you have something you want to close us out with. Oh, you're muted.
I wanted to thank our audience for coming today, joining us. Once again, we have our third event in April, and we will be sending information to you as our trusted audience that is embracing what we're sharing here. So thank you for coming. We are an appreciation.
We are breaking ground together, seeding ground and lifting heavy, heavy burdens. So wishing you all the best of luck and thank you, everyone. Aaron, I'm going to make you the co-host now, and I'm going to stop the recording. or I will attempt to. Dwayne, can you stop the recording before they start this?